Okay, in this series of videos, we're going to take a look at multifamily and get a little overview of that property type, and then also jump into our first discussion of pro forma and coming up with income projections, cash flow projections for real estate. So, because this is a real estate investment class, we're going to be taking a big look at that, the numbers here. And thankfully, multifamily numbers are pretty straightforward. It's pretty easy to deal with them. Once we get into the other property types, it'll be a little bit more complicated. Office, retail have some other kind of quirks about them that make them a little bit trickier to do the math and the investment analysis, but apartments are pretty straightforward. So anyway, let's jump into apartments and take a look at the overview here. And first, we'll just start with the notion about multifamily real estate, and that it is providing housing. So it's a place for people to live. It's going to be at higher density and typically going to be a cheaper alternative to buying for people that need housing. So it's an affordable option typically. That doesn't mean that there are not super expensive apartments and maybe even apartments more expensive than housing, but multifamily and apartment units typically are going to be on the more affordable side. Apartments are important for affordability, so they are usually going to be the housing choice of the housing of choice for people with more limited financial means, people that have perhaps less than the average income for an area. They're gonna tend to move towards apartments in terms of their housing choices. Now, one thing about multifamily, the density is higher. That means there's more units per unit of area. So if we think of area in terms of acres, that's the kind of the normal real estate way of thinking about an area. So if we think about the number of units per acre, that would be the density. The number of people per acre, again, that would be the density. And so because apartments are higher density, they are kind of everything else being equal, they're a little bit more stressful on the infrastructure of a city. And so one of the things that kind of affects the multifamily world is there's going to be particular zoning, particular areas of the city where apartments are zoned and allowed. And one last kind of piece of multifamily is that in certain circumstances, certain places, there's going to be a fair amount of the not in my backyard syndrome, where homeowners in particular don't necessarily want a large apartment complex built very nearby because for all those reasons on the stresses on the infrastructure. There's going to be a lot more traffic, a lot more cars on the road, a lot it's going to be more difficult to get in and out. It just makes things, I don't know, maybe a little bit more painful for homeowners in the area. So there's sometimes resistance to apartments from other constituents in the area. So let's look at some types of apartments. Talk about some different types. The most common, I think, are these first two bullet points: garden style apartments, walk-up apartments. These are very common, in particular in suburban areas. Garden style apartments. Actually, I have a little map. Let's look at that site plan. This would be a picture of a garden style apartment where you have a bunch of units, apartment buildings rather, and these might have anywhere from 6 to 12 units each. Could be typically going to be a couple of stories, but there's a green area. It's kind of spread around a little campus setting. You got a pool, you got a clubhouse. This is kind of a very common setup of apartments in cities, particularly in suburban areas of cities. So these are ubiquitous all across the country. A walk-up apartment would just be one where you're walking into your unit, you're going to climb stairs or just walk in, as opposed to a mid-rise or a high-rise where you're more likely to have require the use of an elevator, right? So if you've got a 4-story, 6-story, or much bigger for a high-rise, you don't necessarily want to be climbing all those stairs to get to your unit. So mid-rise, high-rise are going to be much higher in stature, much more dense in terms of their units per acre. And then we can also think of the types of apartments. We could think about the appearance of apartments, specialized appearance. So you got loft units. They're going to have, frequently they're going to have the exposed brick and maybe some wood beams and, feel kind of Spartan in terms of their interior. You might have micro apartments. Those are kind of becoming a thing around the country and in particular markets. You might have luxury apartments where there's going to be lots of nice amenities, very nice finishes, also very high rents per unit per month. And then we could also think about apartments in terms of the customers. So we could have student housing, so apartments that kind of are tailored towards students. And in fact, people other than students may be precluded from renting there, right? So we may have an age restriction, or you got to be a student at a particular university to live in this place. Senior housing would be another kind of a specialized customer. This would be housing or apartments that are limited or restricted to people 55 and older, typically. That would be the senior category. And then subsidized housing is kind of specialized along the lines of income and financial need. And so you'd have to have below a certain threshold in terms of area median income to qualify for subsidized housing. So, and this is by no means exhaustive. There could be many, many other ways that we could think of splitting up and categorizing the apartment world. This is just kind of maybe the preponderance of the unit types or the types of apartments. Here's a few, this next slide has a few pictures of these kinds of things. So, this is in my mind a little bit luxurious up here in the top left corner. You got the nice, pretty, looks like a new property, has a nice pool, nice little setup here. Who knows, what the interior looks like, but to me that could be easily be a luxury apartment. Here's a picture of a mid-rise. Here's a high-rise down here in the middle. Here'd be kind of a loft setup here. And then micro unit, you can kind of see there's a TV, you got your kitchen appliances, and maybe this is the fold-out bed. So this could be very well be a micro unit. And then above my head here, this looks like it could be a garden style apartment, very, very common looking setup. So, and then one other quick distinction between apartments and their close relatives, the condominium. In some circumstances, actually, a condominium could have been an apartment. It might have had a previous life as an apartment. Early on in my career, I worked with a company that did condominium conversions. So we would buy apartment units and then convert those to condominiums. So you're in a sense buying these things in wholesale, and then you're splitting them up, doing a condo map on them, and going through a variety of legal maneuvers so you can subdivide these and sell them individually, and then you're selling them on a retail basis. So the difference between buying wholesale and selling retail is kind of the profit center, and it has been a very lucrative business across many markets across the country over time. So with that, let's move on to some other characteristics of multifamily units. They're typically going to have short leases. So a 3-month to a 12-month lease is going to be very common. 12 months is, depending on the market, maybe the most common or prevalent lease type, but you could have shorter term leases. And again, it's going to depend on the clientele. If you're talking about executive housing, for instance, you might have executive apartments that are furnished, very high cost. They might be short-term leases, 2 to 3 months, something like that. But many apartment units, they're going to be leased on a 6 to 12-month basis, I would say. There's typically been or historically been abundant financing for the construction and purchase of multifamily. So from an investment standpoint, finding money to finance these was typically very easy. You could usually get the highest loan to value on multifamily compared to other property types like office or retail. So historically the financing has been abundant. Typically they've been lower risk as well. So apartment units have been seen as being among the lower risk types of commercial properties compared to like office, retail, or industrial. Maybe you might could argue about the industrial part, but it's been a very favored group in the past. Now, of course, in recent times we've had the pandemic to deal with, and there's a whole new set of issues that have been raised with multifamily in this COVID world. Along the lines of new risks being exposed. So if renters are getting kind of special dispensations with respect to their rent payments, by virtue of legislation that's passed to keep people from getting foreclosed. I guess not foreclosed, but evicted from their apartments. And you can stay in an apartment without paying rent. That creates kind of cash flow issues for an investor. It makes financing actually a little bit trickier. So, if we have investors, owners of apartments that aren't able to collect sufficient rent, they may be having difficulty with their mortgage payments, the payments required for the lending of their apartment units, and so there can be in certain circumstances these cascading problems because of this pandemic world that we're in. Some other things to think about with multifamily, population growth and household formation are going to be kind of the big keys that drive the demand for multifamily. Now, those are going to be, in many ways, very closely tied to job growth, but it's really about the growth of people, the need of people to have housing that's going to be pushing demand for multifamily. And then supply of multifamily is going to be a function of land prices, of construction costs, and then also of any particular municipal issues in an area. So some cities are going to be very perhaps friendly towards multifamily development and welcome it. They desire affordable options for housing, and they're going to kind of work with developers to bring that in. Other places, it's going to be much more difficult to bring in multifamily and higher density uses to provide housing. So all of these things make multifamily kind of an interesting world, an interesting niche. And we'll be looking and talking about that hopefully with guest speakers. So we'll have that very soon. And it's a very interesting, exciting world. Hopefully some of you will, this will catch your interest and you might find a career in that. But I'm going to go ahead and stop here. We're going to get into developing a pro forma. With the next video, we're going to talk through the cash flow projection for a multifamily property and start to build a framework not only for multifamily but for other property types as we continue to move through this section of the class. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here for this first video, and we'll pick up in the second video with developing a pro forma, and we'll walk through the rest of the slides. And so I will see you then.